Deputy Speaker. I think I'd like to start by saying what, in opposition to this bill, neither I nor do I believe anybody else who's expressing opposition is opposed to, and that is to an immigration policy or immigration acts. Everybody who is taking part in this debate recognises that there requires to be an immigration policy. I remember many years ago as a young Scottish Justice Secretary going to visit my counterpart in the Republic of Ireland, expressing concern for difficulties that they were having when they were requiring to make changes, I think even constitutional changes, because at one stage, if you were born in Ireland, you were guaranteed citizenship, and people were flying in literally to give birth to try and get round that. It was myself who was rather naive. Ireland has a very proud record in how it deals with immigrants. Ireland has a very proud record in how it deals with those seeking asylum and refugee crises. But they do recognise that you have to have an immigration policy. So in opposing this bill, nobody is suggesting unlimited immigration. Absolutely. That has to be dealt with in a coordinated manner. But equally, what it is fundamentally about is the manner in which it is being done, and in particular, the steps that are being taken against those who are most vulnerable, who are most requiring aid, support, sanctuary and whatever else, those who are asylum seekers and refugees. By all means.
Not agree that this bill does still provide a route for the most vulnerable, but it's based on the need and not on the willingness to make a dangerous journey.
Is putting so many obstacles it's going to make life extremely difficult for those who are already the most challenged. There are also actions that do require to be taken against modern slavery, because again I go back to my days of Justice Secretary. I don't believe that actually significantly more legislation is required. I think in fact what is required is coordination. I remember back, and we're now going back over 7 years, requiring to establish a task force because we realised that in dealing with serious organised crime, the establishment of a task force, getting everybody around the table from whatever authority was necessary, what worked and what maximised the power and punch for the forces of law enforcement. With regard to modern slavery, that was done. It wasn't simply done with those forces in Scotland, it was done with forces from Northern Ireland. Because at that stage, and I've no doubt it's in a minute, at that stage, and I've no doubt it's still the situation, there was a link and a coordination between paramilitary groups. At that stage, it was a paramilitary group in Scotland, or based in Scotland, that was operating modern slavery in Belfast. So that coordination with my then counterpart, Mr Ford, was welcome. I also remember bringing together the business community and indeed local authority. And I remember speaking to the senior representative from the Scottish business community who'd said that when they had turned up at the meeting, they didn't realise why they had been called. When they finished the meeting, they realised precisely why they were there. Because there is this suggestion that modern slavery is all to do with the sex trade. It's usually purely put in tabloid newspapers or whatever else. But it's not. The overwhelming victims of modern slavery are working in agriculture, they're working in other aspects, they're being used and abused. It might suit the titillation of some to suggest it's a sex trade, and that does happen, tragically. But equally it goes beyond that. But that was why we required to have coordination, not legislation. Similarly to those who are coming in and seeking to feign marriages and whatever else, that's about coordination with registrars and local authorities. It's not about seeking to grandstand, to say you're bringing in these new fantastic laws, when at the end of the day, laws only work if you've got the coordination, the force and the resources. And that's why we have to make sure that the NCA, Police Scotland, police services south of the border and indeed across in Northern Ireland, along with all those other organisations, both civil and indeed in the legal process, are working. That's what needs done, not simply to look tough. By all means, Madam.
You just mentioned about the fact that we need to know about organised crime. Is it not absolutely right, in the 21st century, it is important for a nation to know who is coming into the country, how they are getting here, who is coming, who is crossing to be here? How on earth can you control organised crime if you've got no idea who is entering the country?
I think with regard to serious and organised crime, certainly in Scotland, I think through the NCA it's already been mapped. We actually know who it is. What we're required to do is to work against them. With regard to those coming in, then that comes back to the now recently departed Donald Rumsfeld. There's no unknowns. There's a lot of people who we know are active people trafficking gangs. There are others that we don't. That is actually about police resource, police intelligence, and that's how we deal with it, not by compounding the hardship upon people who are already suffering. Because, by all means.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to him for giving me and for the very informed comments he's making from a place of experience, from actually being in government. But the honourable gentleman, of course, answers his own point. The way to deal with this issue is to actually increase the size of the legal resettlement programme. That undercuts people smuggling. Otherwise, we're engaging in a war like the war on drugs, a war against people smuggling that just can't be won.
Yeah. Absolutely, I fully agree, and I'm grateful for your eloquent contribution. I think in opposing this bill, it's about seeking to protect values, as indeed has been mentioned, as well as opposing actions. Actions that I believe, in terms of where people are to be placed and indeed how they are to be treated, are fundamentally wrong. On each of them, I believe that there are clear failures. Foreign venues, that seems to be mentioned and trumpeted. I think what we've seen in Australia with the use of Nauru was frankly shameful, and indeed they even appear to be backtracking from that because of the failures that have occurred there. There seemed to be little planning or suggestions, because the recent parliamentary questions I've asked, if you just give me a minute, the recent parliamentary questions as to about what jurisdiction would apply, who would be in charge, we don't know. We're just told to believe that the 1951 Act will be adhered to and all will be well. In Scotland we would say all would be hunky-dory. No, it won't. What you're seeking to do is to move people to a place away from visibility where they will be treated appallingly. It has been dreadful in Australia, and it would be shameful if this country were to replicate it. If a member wants to.
What the UK government's proposing at all, but will the honourable gentleman pick up the point? He opposes offshore detention centres. The opposition often oppose onshore detention centres. Where does he want these people who've got no proven status, some of whom we need to be deported? Where does he think they should be kept?
We do have to be detained, and we do have measures for detaining them. But in the main, you don't have to detain people. And I will again digress to talk about a story not from my period as a Justice Secretary, but as a defence agent. When I once represented a young woman who had been detained as an asylum seeker, the crime was working in a restaurant in Orkney. She was being detained in HM Prison, Aberdeen. There was no Chinese translator. It was an overwhelmingly male prison. She was frightened witless. Those of us who know Orkney will know that you can't get off the island without either boarding a ferry or a plane. There was no way of her being able to escape, and to lock her up when she was no danger was frankly shameful. That was over 25 years ago, and things sadly are much, much worse now. Because I always remember an old friend of mine who was a prison governor and indeed a penologist saying that, if you wanted to look at who the vulnerable and weakest members of a society were, you look at who was in prison. You look at a prison in a society, you look in America and it's the black population. You look in Britain and it's the ethnic minorities. You look in Australia and it's the Aborigines. You look in Scotland and it's the poor. Equally, you can take that corollary and say, who are those that are coming? From what lands are they coming? That tells you where the periods of the areas of conflagration are and where the areas of natural, not at the moment, the areas of natural disaster. Because replicating that are people coming from Afghanistan, from Syria, from the Yemen, from Iran and Iraq, where there have been war and carnage, and that is what they are fleeing, and that is why we have a duty to support them. Because, no, I've got to make some progress. That is why we've got to make some progress, because it goes against the values, I believe, not only do we hold in Scotland, but I do believe that are replicated across the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. People have come to this country. The Huguenot French, the Jews fleeing the pogroms, Basque children escaping Franco's atrocities. They've come here, they've been welcomed, and we are proud of that. And that is something that England and Wales are right to be proud of. Scotland has its own immigration, and I'll deal with that in a minute, but that's something in which I think those who have come to this country and those from south of the border are right to take pride in. In Scotland, we've similarly seen people having to flee. In fact, I say to my members from Northern Ireland, the first of those fleeing in probably were those fleeing from the north of Ireland in the 1798 rebellion, who had to get out after the defeat of the rebellion and, no, not at the moment, the conflagration that took on. That was followed by those who fled Ireland from the famine. It's been followed by those who came similarly south of the border, fleeing the Jewish pogroms or war. Scotland has benefited from these people coming. They have made us a better country. As others have said before, we are losing population and we require people to come here, not simply retirees who wish to go and buy a nice house on the basis of their pension or the property they have sold. We have to have people of younger age willing, able to come here and work, and many of those are asylum seekers and refugees. That is why we need to have them coming, because Scotland has a need for them, and equally it's about representing our values. These are universal values, but every day I see people lining up here for prayers. Why is it we line up for prayers if it's not that those who are in this chamber are supposed to act according to values, whether Augustinian or whatever else? It's because within those values, certainly within the Christian faith, church was viewed as a sanctuary. And yet the terms of this bill remove sanctuary, not from a church building. They remove sanctuary from this entire country. It is entirely wrong. It goes against the values of the people, not simply of England and Wales, but of Scotland and the United Kingdom as a whole. And those on the other side who are fueling racism should be ashamed. Yeah.